We thank that speaker. We'd now like to hear from the third opposition speaker.
Proposition has lost today's debate for one main reason, and that's because they think that they're arguing for a dichotomy between trying Kenyatta and something similar to the TRC. That's not the case. In Kenya, the feelings that people have following these atrocities have not been dealt with constructively. They haven't simply disappeared. They're brewing under the surface, waiting to come out. That's why they've lost this debate, because they failed to realize that when Kenya withdraws from the ICC, people perceive it as that government undermining the importance of justice, undermining the importance of the victims and the family of those victims of that atrocity. I'm going to be speaking about three clashes. Firstly, the legitimacy of the trial itself. Secondly, stability and reconciliation and how that is achieved by remaining in the ICC. And thirdly, the international status of Kenya. So firstly, let's look at the legitimacy of the trial. So Proposition gave us three reasons why they think it's illegitimate. Firstly, they said that it's based on morality that isn't applicable to the Kenyan context. Secondly, they said that it's in some way neo-colonialist because it's targeted specifically at African leaders. And thirdly, they said that Kenyatta was legitimately elected. So let's firstly look at this idea of the imposition of morality. So here we'd say two things. One, we'd say that it's based on basic principles that any country does accept. There's no country in the world where the cultural relativism of that country means that they don't abide by these very basic principles. We aren't imposing morality. But secondly, even if we are imposing morality, we think that these are principles which should be imposed. These are basic principles about basic fundamental human rights. Secondly, let's look at the idea of neo-colonialism. We don't really understand this point. We don't think that the ICC is specifically targeted at African leaders. Sure, we think that in many cases African leaders are tried more, but that's simply because in Africa there are weaker democratic structures of accountability, so it just so happens to be more needed. That simply proves that it's even more necessary for an African country to be part of that structure. So then lastly, they said that it was a fair election. So what we'd say here is that if he's guilty, if he is convicted of those crimes, that means that it wasn't a fair election. That means that it was coerced because of that fear that he created. More than that, even if he was fairly elected, that doesn't mean that a criminal should still be allowed to be in power. Proposition asked us, even if we want to try Kenyatta, why try him now? Try him now because now he's a president. Now he has the most power that he will ever have over an entire country. That's why it's so specifically important to do it now. No. So secondly, let's look at stability and reconciliation. I'm going to be showing you three things. One, involvement with the ICC doesn't undermine these ends. Two, Proposition doesn't achieve these ends without the ICC. And thirdly, that the decision to withdraw actively undermines those two aims. But before that, Ilan.
We ask you why his actions in the past necessarily affect his actions in the future. In fact, what we argue is that it makes him more accountable because if he does step out of line, the Kenyan people will rebel.
Well, what we see is that he can't be held accountable within his own country. You need that kind of external actor. Why specifically for a president can't we rely on those local structures of legal accountability? The fact of the matter is that a president is a powerful man. And as a result of that, there's little political will to hold him accountable locally, because anybody who proposes that necessarily undermines themselves. That's why we do need to rely on external legality, specifically for these high-level politicians. No. So, let's move on to stability and reconciliation. So the first question we have to ask is, why does the ICC not undermine stability? So Proposition firstly told us that it undermines stability because it undermines the functioning of government. They told us specifically that one, a president has a specific role which he can't then fulfill while he's at trial. What we see is that he can fulfill this role. You simply can go back and forth between Kenya and the Netherlands, and even if you can't, you can use technology to fulfill that role. More than that, even if he can't fulfill his role, it's not a one-man show. There are other people who can do that for him. Secondly, they told us that it leads to a power vacuum. No, governments are structured hierarchically specifically to avoid that. There's always a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth in command. No, thank you. Thirdly, they said he's needed as a figurehead. Exactly. Presidents are mostly figureheads. You don't necessarily need to be doing anything tangible. Secondly, they told us that the trial delegitimizes the Kenyan government. We gave you a dichotomy here. Either it does delegitimize the Kenyan government because he was guilty and found guilty, in which case we think that he needs to be delegitimized because he's a criminal and it wasn't then a fair election. But secondly, we told you that if he does deserve to be legitimized, if he is innocent, then he is legitimized both in the eyes of the local community and the international community, because then we absolve him of that crime which he didn't commit. So, moving on to the second question, how does Proposition fail to promote stability and reconciliation? So Ulan told you that people have forgotten about the event. We've got a number of responses. One, they haven't, it's just under the surface. Two, even if they had, the decision to reject this actively brings back those tensions. Why? Because it promulgates the perception that he was guilty, but that they still don't value him being tried. Why? Because the perception is that if Kenyatta knows he's innocent, why would he not want to be tried? So the perception is that he's undermining justice, he's undermining those people who suffered simply for his own benefit. So then, let's move on to how does this decision to withdraw themselves from the ICC actively undermine that stability, both in the short and the long term? So firstly, in the short term. So what we see is that Josh told you without any response that the withdrawal sends a dual message. It sends a message that you're undermining the severity of the atrocity, and it sends a message that you prioritize your president over the justice of those families and those survivors. Why is that harmful to stability? So first, why is that harmful? Firstly, on a principled level. What we see is that justice is absolute. Those people deserve justice. They deserve to see Kenyatta tried and either found to be guilty or innocent. But more than that, on a practical level, it harms stability. Why? Because those people feel disenfranchised, which leads to one of two things. Either they become antagonistic to society because they feel that they don't have a place in that society, much like the Muslim community in France, or they choose to isolate themselves from that society. Either way, that's harmful. Now let's quickly look at the long term and how we detriment stability there. We told you three things. One, we harm political discourse because people feel unable to criticize their own government. Two, we harm voting because people feel coerced into voting for that regime. And three, we undermine accountability. This isn't just about Kenyatta. This is about the next potential future atrocity which we want to avoid as well. So lastly, let's move on to the clash of the international status of France. So Ilan told you that rejecting Western imperialism gives them a status as a leader within Africa. We've got a number of responses here. One, we see that there are other ways to gain that kind of unity in Africa. You don't specifically need to undermine the aims of justice and accountability to get that. Secondly, what we see is that relationships with Africa are far less important than the relationships with the West, which Bettina told you are undermined in this instance. And thirdly, what we see is that if it does unite Africa, it unites Africa behind a principle that we don't think they should be standing for. It unites Africa under principles that says that it's fine to legitimize despots, it's fine to undermine justice, it's fine to undermine accountability. We think that if Africa wants to move forward, that's not what they should be uniting behind. Ladies and gentlemen, Team Red Raven has won today's debate because we've shown you that being a part of the ICC is the only way for Kenya to move forward and is the only way to get real justice and reconciliation in that country. Thank you very much.